Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a massive and honestly pretty intense debate surrounding the 2026 World Cup. We're going to unpack some really striking claims from a recent Zito documentary, exploring exactly why this historic event, hosted across the US, Mexico, and Canada, might actually be functioning as a shield for some deeply controversial political realities. So whether you're a diehard soccer fan or just fascinated by global politics, stick around because this intersection of sports and raw power is absolutely wild to see.
Okay, here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll start with the concept of sports washing, then look at the politicization of the 2026 tournament, FIFA's political alliances, security and immigration concerns, and finally we'll wrap up with what critics are calling a global double standard.
Section 1. The concept of sports washing.
So what exactly is sports washing? Well, the documentary defines it as a very deliberate tactic. It's when governments basically use the glitz, the glamour, and that incredible global unity of mega sports events to sanitize their image or, just completely distract from their crimes and misdeeds. Now, historically, we've seen this accusation thrown mostly at non-Western countries. Think Russia in 2018, Qatar in 2022, or the upcoming 2034 tournament in Saudi Arabia. But the core argument of this source material? It's that sports washing is happening right here, right now, in the United States with the 2026 World Cup. And that brings us to the main focus of our explainer today, exactly why this specific instance of sports washing allegedly exists.
Moving right along to Section 2, politicizing the 2026 tournament.
Human rights activist and former pro soccer player Craig Foster makes a really fascinating point here. He argues that the current U.S. administration is uniquely utilizing this global event for, personal and political projection. Foster points out that sure, hosting these events is always a bit political for any country trying to project a certain image. But he claims the current U.S. leadership has literally obliterated the false concept that sport is apolitical. They've centered the event around themselves in a way that is frankly totally unprecedented in his lifetime.
And this hits right at the heart of why this sports washing tactic is allegedly being deployed. According to the documentary, commentators like political scientist Jules Boykoff argue the 2026 World Cup is essentially serving as a glittering smokescreen. Critics claim it's meant to distract us from some deeply controversial policies. We're talking military actions in Iran, foreign policy stances on Gaza, and massive domestic deployments of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. The source even points out a pretty glaring irony. There are travel bans currently affecting nearly 40 nations, and get this, 4 of those nations are actually participating in the World Cup. It's this incredibly aggressive political backdrop that has critics seriously questioning if the U.S. should have even kept its hosting rights in the first place.
Which brings us to Section 3, FIFA's political alliances. Here, the source highlights what they see as a massive, glaring contradiction between what FIFA says on paper and what FIFA actually does in practice. On the one hand, FIFA's official human rights policy explicitly commits to embracing international human rights documents and avoiding adverse human rights impacts. But on the flip side, activists argue that FIFA is completely ignoring those stated ideals. Instead, they claim FIFA actively coddles and enables political figures, basically rewarding behavior that directly undermines international law. Case in point, just this past December, at the World Cup draw in Washington, D.C., FIFA President Gianni Infantino awarded what seems to be a newly invented FIFA Peace Prize to the U.S. President. Now, for critics like Craig Foster, featured in the doc, this isn't just some empty PR gesture. They argue that by handing a peace prize to a leader involved in heavy international military actions, Infantino has essentially turned football into a co-conspirator. They're saying this completely violates FIFA's own human rights slogans and actively enables alleged violations of international law. All right, let's look closer to home with Section 4, Security and Immigration Concerns.
To really grasp the domestic tension here, we have to look at the fans themselves. Hispanics make up over a quarter of all U.S. sports fans. Actually, they made up 40% of the entire U.S. viewing audience for the 2024 Euro Final. This is absolutely crucial to understand, because it means the sport's core American fan base intersects directly with the very Latin American and immigrant communities that are allegedly being heavily targeted by those domestic ICE deployments we mentioned earlier.
And this brings us to a somewhat technical but incredibly impactful policy detailed in the documentary, the NSSE, or National Special Security Event. This is the designation given by the Department of Homeland Security for mega events. Think the Super Bowl, the Olympics, and of course the World Cup. Anti-ICE activist Catherine Fez points out that getting this designation essentially overrides local governance.
It basically creates a testing ground for the hyper-militarization of local police forces by unlocking this massive network of federal communication and resource sharing.
The source describes this whole process as a mega-event security pipeline. It's like a chain reaction. Step 1, the event gets that NSSE designation. Step 2, this instantly forces collaboration between federal agencies and local police. Step 3, suddenly huge pots of federal security funding become available. And Step 4, local police departments use all that new funding to acquire heavy weapons and massively expand their labor force. So the really critical point to take away here is that this structural pipeline leaves a heavily armed legacy in host cities, places like Los Angeles, long after the fans, the media, and the athletes have packed up and gone home.
To put the sheer scale of this militarization into perspective, we're talking about over $1 billion. $1 billion in available mega-event security funding between the upcoming Olympics and the World Cup. The LAPD alone reportedly requested $100 million just for weapons, vehicles, and staffing increases. Critics argue this staggering use of taxpayer funds takes what should be a joyful sports festival and turns it into a permanent, heavily funded domestic policing crackdown.
Let's turn to our final topic, Section 5, a global double standard.
The source material asks a really pointed rhetorical question here. Is the United States exempt from criticism? I mean, really think about it. If local police were being armed to the teeth with millions of dollars of military-grade gear, and minority communities were facing extreme crackdowns in places like Brazil, Russia, or Qatar right before a massive tournament, wouldn't Western governments and media be absolutely outraged? Wouldn't we be hearing loud, constant calls for international boycotts?
The historical comparison is definitely stark. Look at Russia in 2018 and Qatar in 2022. Western media widely and loudly condemned those hosts for human rights issues. Back in 2022, the BBC actually refused to even air Qatar's opening ceremony, choosing to show programming about human rights instead. But for the United States in 2026? The source claims there is a very noticeable hesitance in the media to apply that same sportswashing label. Political scientist Jules Boykoff argues this discrepancy boils down to a massive ethnocentric double standard. He claims it's driven by imperialism, racism, and propaganda, which effectively shields the U.S. from the exact same scrutiny applied to non-Western nations.
And hey, this isn't just some high-level abstract debate. It is having very real, tangible economic and social consequences right now. When the acting ICE director publicly stated his agents would play a key role in World Cup security, that sent an absolute shockwave of fear through international communities. The documentary reports that fans from Latin America, Africa, and Asia are genuinely frightened of apprehension, detention, or even deportation right there at the stadiums. You combine that with existing anxieties about ambient gun violence in the U.S., and the result is a massive chilling effect on tourism. In fact, hotel bookings in host cities are currently way below forecasted levels. Some hotels are even calling the tournament a non-event, which obviously has huge impacts on local economies.
Ultimately, this explainer leaves us with a really critical, provocative question to ponder. Will the 2026 World Cup ultimately be remembered as a global festival of unity, exactly like FIFA promises? Or, when you consider the massive political shielding, the domestic militarization, and the glaring media double standards outlined by our sources, will it go down as the most successful sportswashing campaign in modern history? It really urges all of us to look beyond the pitch and carefully consider the geopolitical forces at play. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.